1900s, which sociologist Rayford Logan has described as the nadir, or the lowest period for Africans in America, also produced some of our most prolific entertainment figures. Filmmakers like Oscar Micheaux in his film The Homesteader and William Foster in his film The Railroad Porter began to speak for the masses of African Americans. They presented an opposing viewpoint to the white supremacist belief which fostered films like Birth of a Nation.
A lot of black filmmakers got started primarily to answer the Birth of a Nation. Oscar Micheaux is someone you could probably characterize as a black filmmaker who was really inspired to answer these kinds of representations on film. But there were actually a few filmmakers black filmmakers working before The Birth of a Nation was released. There was a black man in Chicago named William Foster who made what's supposed to be the first black produced film in 1913, The Railroad Porter, which was like a short comedy about like a black middle class kind of love triangle situation. But more importantly, there is the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, which was established in 1916 out west. There were lots of black filmmakers who started their careers in western states. Oscar Micheaux and Noble Johnson of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company were two of those men. And the Lincoln Company produced about 4 or 5 dramatic films. They were longer than the short comedies that William Foster was making, and they were like uplift narratives. They were films about African Americans who were educated, who were trying to do things that would improve the education of the race. They were trying to find oil out west and that kind of thing. They'd always end up with these happy endings, these romantic kind of couplings with the woman they loved and that kind of thing. And these films, Lincoln films, were extremely popular all over the United States because black audiences were starved for some kind of positive representation. And so even though the stories that they showed probably weren't typical of what most African Americans were living, like these films were really popular in cities like Chicago and New York where nobody knew about this frontier life or anything, they were simply exciting for them as a reflection of some kind of positive blackness that they weren't getting in other films, they weren't getting in newspapers and magazines and that kind of thing. I mean, this is a period where you still have people with Mammy cookie jars on their counters, and whenever you would pick up a newspaper, any black image was a caricature. And so people really wanted to see some kind of demonstration that African Americans had positive qualities, that there were educated people, that there were people trying to improve their lives. And it meant even more to them that it was black people making these movies too. And the early film companies would always use the fact that they were black owned as part of their promotion. So to go see this movie was like to support a black business, to support the race. So this whole industry, this race film industry, grew up out of these concerns about black entrepreneurship, as well as just this idea of wanting to entertain black audiences. So the Lincoln Motion Picture Company was going strong, and they found out about this young novelist out of South Dakota named Oscar Micheaux, who had written a novel they wanted to make into a film. And they approached him about it, and they started to work out a deal. And then this upstart, Oscar Micheaux, said, well, you know, I want to direct this movie myself, and I want it to be 7 reels long. And the Lincoln movie was only 3 reels long. And they were like, well, you know, that's not going to happen. You don't know anything about filmmaking, and the budget, it's way too much. And he said, well, I'll just make the movie myself. And they kind of laughed at him. But when he made that movie, The Homesteader, in 1918, it was the first of almost 40 films he would end up making over the course of his career. And he long outlasted the Lincoln Company. They folded in the early 20s. He was making movies until 1948. He's the only black filmmaker to successfully make the transition from the silent period to the sound period. And he made a really wide variety of interesting films. For the past few decades of black film criticism, the only silent film we knew about of Oscar Micheaux's was one called Body and Soul, starring Paul Robeson. It was Paul Robeson's first movie, where he plays a really bad preacher who does some really bad things. It was a really controversial movie to show black preachers doing the wrong thing. But in the past 5 or 6 years, they've discovered a bunch of Michaux's other silent films, which has given us a much broader picture of what his movie making was like during the sound period. The one that I like the most is a film called Within Our Gates, which was released in early 1920. And I like this film because it is explicitly an answer to The Birth of a Nation in a lot of really interesting ways. For example, in The Birth of a Nation, you have this romantic sort of coupling of the white North and the white South. And when they marry, then we understand that the birth of the nation has happened, that the nation has overcome this rift from the Civil War, and they're going to move on into the future, and black people have nothing to do with that. What Michaud does in Within Our Gates is he has a black woman from the South and a black man from the North get married. And so he tries to reproduce a different kind of birth of a black nation, right? Like he's trying to show that there can be this unity among African Americans that are living all across the country. And he has characters who are very well educated, in addition to those who are really uneducated. He has upstanding black characters, and he has morally corrupt black characters, and he has light-skinned characters and dark-skinned characters. He really tries to show the great diversity of the black community, and he's really concerned about not just giving a monolithic picture, either too negative or too positive in a lot of ways. So it's a really mature film. And it's a kind of film that people, I don't think, really knew Oscar Micheaux was making. When people have seen some Oscar Micheaux films, they usually seen the sound films, which are really different. Like, they're trying to be like gangster movies or romance movies, and they kind of seem like Hollywood knockoffs in some ways. But his silent work has such a political charge that I think it's really made people think differently about the kinds of films he was making. But Micheaux was, I guess, just one major figure in a huge race film industry. There were companies all over the country, the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast, making films for this segregated black audience. I mean, it became quite obvious that African American communities had money, that they were going to the movies anyway, and they would really go to the movies if they could see something that had black characters in it. So you have everything from black westerns, black romance movies, black crime movies being made for this separate population. And it was really thriving from the 1920s. It was at a peak sort of in the early 1920s. And then again, during the sound period, you had a lot of black film production during those times.
The northward migration of African Americans leaving the South swelled the black populations of large urban areas, but nowhere did African American culture and lifestyle dominate the national consciousness as dramatically as it did in New York City's Harlem. At the end of World War I, Harlem contained the largest black urban population in the world and quickly became the black cultural center, attracting immigrants from Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, the British West Indies, and elsewhere, bringing with them their languages, religions, foods, music, and literature. This period is now known as the Harlem Renaissance.
That period of the early 20th century is a tremendously active period where black folks are getting in print, where you have this kind of leadership element to the forefront, even with the death of Washington in 1915. Still, I think you can see that it's a period where black folks are trying to articulate, and their leadership to articulate, where do we go? What is the best way for us to proceed in order to advance as a people? Is it we give up on America and go back to Africa? Is it we struggle, as Randolph liked to say, from within and make the system work? Or as Du Bois says, I mean, do we form all these different organizations like the NAACP and try and get change to make the system fair? The reality is all of these individuals wanted the race to advance. And you can add to that group people like William Monroe Trotter, and you can go on and on with so many other. Mary McLeod Bethune, who comes in a little bit later as we move into the 1930s. But I mean, and from the great figures to figures who are perhaps lesser known ones, black folks are trying to find themselves. And when you put it in that context, one can then begin to appreciate virtually why there is what we later call a Harlem Renaissance, why it comes about. Because black folks are searching, trying to define themselves, trying to map out the road for their own salvation. So it would be, I think, almost logical as we look back now that we began to see this fruition in literature. We began to see black folks writing books and getting published in substantial numbers. Blacks had written before, of course, but now we move into the 20th century, and those first 2 or 3 decades of it, and what many would call the Harlem Renaissance, we're seeing black folks writing about, explaining, articulating what it is to be black in America. Trying to define and trying to discover one's own roots, those African roots, those West Indian roots, those roots from the South, those roots squarely in the North, and as a number of writers of the period explained it, trying to define one another, trying to define us as a race. Some have talked about this phenomenon as race building, and that black folks were, for the first time, really coming together as a people. And we can see it in the literature, the books, the songs, the music, which this early part of the 20th century is just ablaze with. It is a booming period of consciousness. What's fascinating to me, and we were just up at the Schomburg Center, and when you look back through some of the photographic collections, you look at black folks in the period, let's say 1915, 20, so forth, in that period, you see them in the coffee houses. They're sitting and talking about the issues of the day, reading the newspapers, engaged, intellectually engaged. What's also fascinating, you see the street scenes any old day of the week, particularly in a place like New York or Harlem on a Wednesday, and you see black folks strolling along, and they're well dressed. Women have on nice dresses, and men on ties and shirts and jackets, etc. We're talking about a very different Harlem than we typically think of today, and it was that center of intellectualism, etc. But other places would have it as well. Chicago would have its version of it, to be sure, with people like Robert Abbott and the Chicago Defender, and it had its own Du Bois societies there as well. And it had its followers of Booker T. Washington's ideology, to be sure, too. I think much more so the Du Bois kind of school of thought. And, of course, we have writers and artists in Chicago, as most areas can claim to be a part of this Harlem Renaissance. But again, I think it is what Alan Locke best described in his book on the Harlem Renaissance and the so-called, as he called it, the New Negro. And what Alan Locke described was a race finding itself for the first time in its history and articulating that. And again, I would say in part this is coming about because we had not done it before in such large numbers. And it's of necessity to do it. You've got to define yourself as a people and what it is you have in common as a people. And whatever the different approaches to the salvation of the race and the right road to go, etc., you first have to understand where you come from, where you've been, what that history is.
People don't really know about a lot of the black literary production that was going on at the turn of the century, beyond like Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk from 1903, or even Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery, that was published in 1900. But there were a number of other black writers who were working around that time, or before those books were published as well. I'm trying to think, like Anna Julia Cooper or Frances Harper were women who were really active in both black political movements and women's rights movements, and they were publishing fictional works around this time. And somebody like James Weldon Johnson, who was doing all kinds of different activities. I mean, that's one of the amazing things to me about looking at black writers from the early part of the century, is that writing was just one tool they used in a much broader kind of political, social project they were engaged in. I mean, James Weldon Johnson was so active with the NAACP and other things, and then he was an attorney and he was a linguist and all these wonderful accomplishments, and he was also writing fiction. His book, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, which I think he published in 1912, is seen as one of the books that sort of bridges the turn of the century moment and the Harlem Renaissance, because it's a modernist text in a lot of ways. He wrote it without saying that he wrote it, sort of anonymously, as a black man who's living as a white man, and people really took him at his word and thought that it was, he didn't own up to having written the book for a long time. And then a lot of writers coming after him, people like Langston Hughes or Claude McKay, or even some of the women writers who would emerge during the Harlem Renaissance period, like Nella Larson, like Zora Neale Hurston. You could tell that they were in a real sort of conversation with each other about how to produce a different kind of African American writing than people had known previously. For a long time, for example, black women writers were afraid to express any kind of sexuality on the part of black women characters because of the stereotypes about black women's sexuality. And it wasn't until people like Nella Larson started to write in the late 1920s that they could at least broach the subject of what parts of a woman's life that people were afraid to talk about prior to that time. And I guess in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, we have all this wonderful poetry and art. Aaron Douglas, these really interesting collaborations that people were doing. And at the same time, there's a real debate about why the movement didn't last so long, why it seems to have ended kind of abruptly with the Depression, what it meant that a lot of these black artists had white sponsors, people who were supporting their work, and the people who were buying their work didn't really reach the black audience they were supposed to be writing about and writing for. And those are really tricky questions. I mean, a lot of people have read the Harlem Renaissance as a failure because it took so long for another black movement in writing and art to happen. But it seems to me that they were doing something that has a really long-lasting impact, because subsequent writers still go back to Langston Hughes and still go back to Claude McKay and find a great deal of inspiration. They're amazed that they were talking about some of the issues they were talking about that early on.
Harlem, however, was not the only mecca for black entertainment during this period. The Midwest, and Chicago in particular, was also bursting at the seams with African American talent. Artists like Cab Calloway and Nat King Cole were products of a city which cultivated talent, not only on an artistic level, but intellectually and politically as well.
Benny Goodman, the king of swing, so-called, because it's white, he popularized jazz music. Though 10 years earlier, Duke Ellington had wrote a number called Don't Mean a Thing If You Ain't Got That Swing, boo-bop, boo-bop, you know. But now it becomes swing. He can now market on his terms this music. Jewish boy from the west side of Chicago, who had learned his jazz in the area of 35th Street and 47th Street from guys like Milton Hinton and great musicians that were Chicago born and bred. But to his credit, and I guess his financial view, he incorporated two blacks into his band, both seasoned musicians, Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson. Lionel's still living, Teddy Wilson's gone. Great pianist, great percussionist, vibraphonist. Incorporated in his band, and they played first in California and then went to New York. We're anxiously waiting to see this phenomenon. And so we hear that they're coming to Chicago and they're going to play the 8th Regiment Armory, which has now been restored as a military academy at 35th and Jive. We're determined we're going to go. My clique, we potting up our money now, getting ready. We're going to go see this new thing. The same night that was to occur, I think it was June 27th or something, 19th, the same night that was to occur, Joe Louis, the great prize fighter, who had lost the year before in a very embarrassing situation to a German by the name of Max Schmeling. They had politicized it so that he wouldn't have to fight Max Schmeling. The championship of the world, he would fight a guy by the name of Jim Braddock, and that would occur at the old Comiskey Park. Since we didn't have enough money or clout to get to the Joe Louis thing, and we wanted to see this very new thing, we didn't think too much about the Joe Louis thing until about the same time. The streets of the South Side were absolutely clear. We had jitneys, which were black-owned jitneys, business that was busy. You could get from the south end of the Black Belt to the north end and vice versa for a dime or 15 cents. People were out on the streets, the radios were on, we didn't have television. Because when Joe Louis had been defeated the year before, a cloud hung over the black community. Our hero had been defeated. I remember the night it happened. I kept waiting for Joe Louis to get themselves together and knock this guy out, but it didn't happen, and finally they had to call the fight off. An old lady the next morning approached me and said, "Son, do you reckon they cheated him?" Tears in her eyes. That's how monumental the facts were. People in the South said that they had to turn their radios either down or so that whites would not hear about Joe Louis fighting. The year before, of course, Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf in the 1936 Olympics had embarrassed the Nazis by their victories in Berlin at the Olympics. But we were feeling a sense of power through these athletes. And Joe Louis, because his was so physical, we felt that sense of power even greater. So that night that night in 1937, we went to see Benny Goodman in order to see the Benny Goodman Trio. We got in and things were swinging. Outside on the streets were full of people, black and white, and the streets were full of people. Somewhere in the early evening, the word came that Joe Louis had knocked Jim Braddock out and was the world champion. Now, I'll say this literally in order for people to catch, if they can recapture the spirit of that evening. We created, almost on the spot, one guy at least, Carl, on the spot, not to humiliate whites, but to inform them and bring them up to date. And these are the lyrics to the words to the kind of poem. It went like this. Joe Louis knocked Jim Braddock down. Jim Braddock got right up, and then Joe Louis knocked him down again. It makes no difference what you say. The champion is a nigga. And we didn't say it to embarrass, but we said it to emphasize that in spite of all, in spite of the prejudice, in spite of the racism, give us a chance, and we'll knock them down. We'll knock them out. Just give us that chance. That was sort of symbolic speech, though we were 17, 18 years old. Some of us were quite creative. Joe Louis walked with his entourage across 35th Street to the 8th Regiment Armory. It was phenomenal. Here you have two great events in the same evening coming together in our neighborhood. It's fantastic. It's impossible to describe.
Coming
his righteous sentence